Officer Dale Kirsch spat in Rosa Delgado's face over a $9 breakfast tab in front of a full dining room at 8:20 on a Sunday morning, and for one full second, nobody in Rosa's diner made a sound. Kirsch did not know, when he did it, that the corner booth behind him, the one he'd walked past without a glance for the better part of a year, held 10 Hells Angels who had been watching him do smaller versions of exactly this for months, and had been waiting for a reason good enough to finally do something about it. He had given them one. What those 10 men did in the next 4 minutes was not something Dale Kirsch, Rosa, or anyone else in that diner that morning ever forgot. Rosa's diner sat on the corner of 5th and Larkin, the way it had for 31 years. A strip of red vinyl booths and a counter worn smooth by 3 decades of elbows. The smell of bacon, grease, and burnt coffee thick enough to taste before the door finished swinging shut behind you. A bell above the door announced everyone who came and went, the same bell Rosa's mother had installed the year she opened the place, still working, still slightly out of tune, a detail nobody had ever felt the need to fix. Sunday mornings brought the after-church crowd, and in the corner booth by the window, the same 10 men who had been claiming that table every Sunday for going on 6 years. They were the local chapter of the Hells Angels, though on a Sunday morning they looked considerably less like the town's idea of trouble, and considerably more like what they actually were. A road captain who ran the tire shop on Vine Street. 2 men who'd served together in the Marines before either of them owned a motorcycle. A retired schoolteacher, a bookkeeper who did half the small businesses downtown's taxes, and 5 others who'd been riding together long enough that most of downtown had stopped seeing the leather and started seeing the regulars. Frank Ibarra, the road captain, was 58, broad through the shoulders, a beard more salt than pepper these days. He'd been coming to Rosa's diner since before Rosa owned it, back when her mother ran the register, and he tipped, without fail, exactly double whatever the bill came to, a habit nobody at that table had ever needed explained to them. Beside him most Sundays sat Walt Simmons, the bookkeeper, a precise, quiet man who noticed numbers the way other people noticed weather, and Cesar Ruiz, one of the 2 Marines who had a habit of counting exits in every room he entered, whether or not anyone else noticed him doing it. The other 7 rotated in and out depending on who'd pulled a Saturday shift or had a grandkid's soccer game running long. But the corner booth itself had not sat empty on a Sunday morning in longer than anyone at that table could remember. And Rosa had, over 6 years, come to set out 10 cups of coffee the moment she saw the first of their bikes pull into the lot, without anyone needing to ask her to. She knew most of their orders by heart the way she knew her own daughters. Frank's black, no sugar. Walt's with exactly 1 creamer. Cesar's so sweet the other 9 had long since stopped commenting on it. They had watched Dale Kirsch operate for the better part of a year. He came in 3, sometimes 4 mornings a week, always in uniform, always seated at the counter, and always, without fail, left without paying. A habit that had started, as these things often do, with a single comped coffee 18 months back, and had metastasized. Slowly and by increments too small to challenge individually, into full breakfasts, extra plates to take back to the station, and a running tab Rosa had stopped even bothering to write down, because writing it down implied she expected someday to collect on it. The escalation had followed a pattern all 10 of them had watched build without ever discussing it directly among themselves until afterward. First it had been the coffee. Then the eggs. Then, 6 months back, Kirsch had started sending plates back over trivial complaints. Bacon not crisp enough, toast the wrong shade, and accepting a full replacement plate free each time rather than the 10% off Rosa offered as a courtesy. 3 months ago, he'd started raising his voice at the newer waitress, a 19-year-old named Priya, who'd quit after 5 weeks without ever telling Rosa the whole reason why. leaving only a two-line note and a returned apron folded neatly on the counter. Frank had clocked all of it, in the particular quiet way men who've spent decades reading a room learn to clock things, and had started keeping his own tally not because he expected to need it, but because some part of him had already suspected, longer than he'd said out loud, that a day like this one was coming. Frank had started keeping his own count instead, quietly, on the back of a receipt he kept folded in his wallet. By his own rough math, Dale Kirsch had eaten somewhere north of $3,000 of food off Rosa's register over 18 months, and had never once, in all that time, so much as reached for his wallet. None of them had said anything to Rosa about it. It was not their place, they'd agreed among themselves early on, to tell a woman running her own business how to handle a cop who might make her life difficult in a dozen small ways if she pushed back. They had kept coming, kept watching, and kept tipping enough on their own tabs to make up some small fraction of the difference. An arrangement none of them found satisfying, but none of them had found a better answer to either. That Sunday morning was the first time any of them had seen Kirsch's temper crack all the way open. Before we get to what happened next, if this is your first time here, go ahead and hit subscribe so this story doesn't get lost in the feed, and drop your city or state down in the comments below. I read every single one, and it means more than you'd guess to see how far a story like this can travel. Now, back to the counter at Rosa's diner. Because what Dale Kirsch was about to do in front of 10 men who had been quietly documenting his behavior for the better part of a year was about to end considerably worse for him than a $9 breakfast tab. Rosa Delgado was 39, a single mother of 2, and had been running the diner her mother built for 11 years, ever since a stroke took her mother's ability to stand behind that register for more than an hour at a time. She worked 6 days a week, opened at 5 most mornings, and had, over 11 years, developed the specific, practiced patience of a woman who had learned that a diner survives or fails on exactly how well its owner can absorb other people's bad days without letting it show. She kept a photo of her mother taped inside the register drawer, faded now from 11 years of sunlight through the front window, and touched it out of habit most mornings before flipping the sign to open. She had absorbed Dale Kirsch's bad days for 18 months, the same patient professionalism she brought to every other difficult customer who'd ever sat at her counter. Except this one never left a tip, never said thank you, and never once seemed to notice that a woman running a diner on thin margins might have a limit like anyone else. She had told herself, at first, that comping a cop's coffee now and then was smart business, the kind of goodwill that kept a patrol car parked visibly outside her diner most mornings, a deterrent to the kind of trouble a business on this corner sometimes attracted late at night. She had told herself, later, once the free coffee became free breakfasts, became a running tab she'd quietly stop tracking, that saying something risked a version of retaliation she could not afford to test. A citation here, a slow response time there. The particular vulnerability of a small business owner whose livelihood depended on staying on reasonable terms with the exact institution meant to protect her. She was saving that year for her older daughter's orthodontic bills and, further off, a community college fund she added $20 to whenever the week allowed it. She could not afford a war with a police officer. She had decided 18 months ago that free breakfasts were the cost of doing business in a town this size, and she had gotten good at smiling through it. The specific professional smile of a woman doing arithmetic behind her own eyes that nobody on the other side of the counter was meant to see. That morning, her register had come up considerably short after a supplier's price increase she hadn't fully accounted for, the kind of small financial gut punch that arrives on an already difficult week, and for the first time in 18 months. When Dale Kirsch finished his breakfast and stood to leave without reaching for his wallet, Rosa said something. Dale, Her voice came out steadier than she expected it to. I'm going to need you to settle up today. Today's, not all of it. Today, Kirsch turned around slowly, the particular slowness of a man recalibrating an expectation he had not realized was even negotiable. Excuse me? $9, Rosa said. That's all I'm asking. You're asking me to pay. He said it like the words themselves tasted wrong in his mouth. After everything I do for this town, you're going to nickel and dime me over a plate of eggs? It's not nickel and diming, Dale. It's the bill. His face did something then that Rosa had seen building for 18 months without ever believing it would surface all the way. A flush of genuine disproportionate rage at the idea of being asked by a woman he had long since stopped considering an equal party to any transaction, to pay for something he had decided, somewhere along the way, he was owed. You know what, Kirsch said, voice rising enough that the whole dining room's conversation dropped away beneath it. I keep this whole street safe. I keep people like you safe. And this is the thanks I get? Dale, you don't get to nickel and dime the man who makes sure nobody breaks your windows at 2 a.m, Kirsch said, talking over her now, his voice carrying the specific certainty of a man who had never once, in 18 months, needed to consider that anyone might push back. You want to start charging me? Fine. Let's see how fast that patrol car stops parking outside your diner. He spat in her face before she finished the sentence. It landed across her cheek and the collar of her uniform, and for one full second, the entire diner went silent, in a way Rosa's diner had never gone silent before. Not the ordinary quiet of nobody talking, but the particular airless silence of 30 people watching something happen that none of them, individually, believed they had the standing to stop. Rosa froze, one hand halfway to her own face, too stunned to finish the motion, her whole body trembling with an adrenaline that had nowhere yet to go. In the corner booth, 10 men who had spent 18 months telling themselves it was not their place to intervene discovered, all at once and without needing to discuss it, that it had become exactly their place. Frank Ibarra was the first one out of the booth, and the other 9 were on their feet within a second of him, the specific, unhurried unison of men who had ridden together long enough to move as a single decision rather than 10 separate ones. Kirsch turned at the sound of 10 chairs scraping back at once, and whatever satisfaction had been sitting on his face a half-second earlier drained out of it fast. Wipe your face, Rosa, Frank said, not loudly, not taking his eyes off Kirsch. You don't have to stand here for the rest of this. Thank you, Rosa whispered, wiping her cheek with the back of her hand, her voice barely making it past the shock still sitting in her chest. Walt Simmons, the bookkeeper, already had his phone out, already filming. That's assault, Walt said, in front of 30 witnesses. Rosa, still holding her cheek, looked at the 10 of them standing between her and Kirsch, and found herself, for the first time in 18 months, without the practiced professional smile she usually kept ready for exactly this kind of moment. I didn't want to make trouble, she whispered, mostly to Frank, though loud enough that Kirsch heard it too. You didn't make any, Frank said. He did. All by himself, 18 months running, in front of 30 witnesses. You people don't understand who you're dealing with, Kirsch said, though his voice had lost the certainty it carried 30 seconds earlier. I'm a police officer. You want to explain to my captain why 10 bikers surrounded me in a diner? Funny, Frank said. I was about to ask you to explain the same thing to your captain. Except I've got 18 months of a specific number to bring with me. Kirsch's composure broke at that. Something cold moving behind his eyes as the shape of his last year and a half began, visibly, to reassemble itself in his mind as something considerably more documentable than he'd ever let himself consider. $3,140, Frank said. Give or take. That's my count of what you've eaten off this woman's register without paying since last spring. I've got the dates. Cesar's got most of them too, independently, since we compared notes a while back without telling you why. That's not. You can't prove that. Don't need to prove all of it today, Frank said. Today we've got 30 witnesses and a phone recording of you spitting on a woman for asking you to pay $9. Rest of it's a conversation for whoever handles police misconduct complaints in this county. You've been keeping a tab on me, Kirsch said, something almost disbelieving in his voice, as though the idea that anyone had been paying that close attention had genuinely never once occurred to him in 18 months of assuming nobody would. Somebody had to, Cesar said, speaking for the first time. Seemed like it wasn't going to be you. Kirsch's eyes went to the door, then to the window, doing the same math-cornered men in his position tend to do, except the math here was considerably simpler than usual. 10 men stood between him and every exit, not touching him, not threatening him with anything beyond the plain fact of having witnessed exactly what he'd done. Through the window, their 10 motorcycles sat parked in a row along the curb, engines cold and silent, a detail that would have meant nothing to Kirsch an hour earlier and now sat in his peripheral vision like a held breath. This isn't over, Kirsch said, though his voice had lost most of what made that sentence a threat rather than a formality. For you, it's starting, Frank said. Sit down. We'll wait for actual police together. I am actual police. Not for much longer, Walt said, still filming. Not after this gets uploaded. The real patrol car that arrived 11 minutes later, called in by the diner's own manager rather than by anyone at the corner booth, found a room full of calm, cooperative witnesses. A video already circulating among half the phones in the building, and a suspect who had spent those 11 minutes sitting exactly where Frank told him to sit, saying almost nothing. Dale Kirsch was placed on administrative leave that same afternoon, and the internal affairs review that followed, moving with unusual speed once the video reached a local news outlet by that evening, uncovered a pattern considerably wider than one diner. 2 other business owners on the same block came forward within the week, describing similar arrangements they had felt unable to refuse. One of them a hardware store owner who estimated Kirsch had walked out with close to $2,000 in unpaid merchandise over 3 years. The other a dry cleaner who admitted, somewhat sheepishly, that she had been pressing Kirsch's uniforms for free for nearly as long, without ever finding a moment that felt safe to bring it up. The investigating sergeant, reviewing 18 months of Frank's carefully kept receipt tallies alongside Walt's independent set of dates, would later tell a reporter that it was the most thoroughly documented pattern of low-level extortion his department had seen in a decade, made possible entirely by 10 men who had decided, quietly, and without any expectation of credit, that somebody ought to be keeping count even if nobody had asked them to. He would add off the record that it was also the fastest an internal complaint against an officer had ever moved through his office, a fact he attributed less to the video itself than to the sheer inconvenience of 200 angry phone calls a day from people who had seen it. Kirsch was charged with simple battery for the spitting incident alone, and separately with theft of services once the pattern across multiple businesses was documented. He resigned from the force before the department could complete the process of firing him, which changed little about the outcome and nothing about what 30 witnesses in a Sunday morning diner had already seen with their own eyes. The county prosecutor's office would later note, in a statement to the local paper, that video evidence combined with independently corroborated financial records had made the case one of the more straightforward prosecutions her office had handled all year. An unusual thing to be able to say about a case involving a police officer's own conduct. Rosa did not have to eat the cost of 18 months of free meals either. The 10 men in the corner booth started ajar by the register the following week, seated with contributions from most of the regulars who'd heard the story by then. And within a month, it had covered not only what Kirsch owed her, but a fair start on her daughter's orthodontic bills besides. Cesar Ruiz, the Marine who counted exits without thinking about it, took to stopping by most afternoons that month to carry the heavier supply deliveries in from her car, a small unasked-for kindness that Rosa noticed and never mentioned out loud either, in a house style of gratitude that seemed to run in both directions at that corner booth. She still runs the diner 6 days a week. The corner booth still fills up every Sunday morning with the same 10 men, though these days Frank leaves a little more than double the bill, and Rosa has stopped entirely, pretending a bad customer is the cost of doing business. She still keeps her mother's photo taped inside the register drawer, and these days, when she touches it each morning before flipping the sign to open, it feels less like a habit born of loss and more like a small daily report to somebody who would have been proud of how the story turned out. She does not think of herself as someone who did anything remarkable. She thinks of herself as a woman who finally said $9 out loud after 18 months of silence, and found out, for the first time in longer than she could remember, that she was not saying it alone. If this story reached you, if you believe the people who serve us every day deserve better than silent endurance, while everyone around them decides it isn't their place to say something, share it with someone who needs the reminder that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is ask to be paid what they're owed. Subscribe so you never miss the next one. And down in the comments, tell me where you're watching from this morning, what your own local diner looks like, and if you believe Rosa deserved every one of those 10 men standing up for her. Type enough below so she knows it reached you too.